The wind cut through the trees like a whisper that had long forgotten warmth. Snow fell in thick silence, erasing the trail behind them with every step forward. Eliza's coat was too thin, her boots cracked and soaked through, and her children, Nathan, barely 10, holding his siblings close trying to be brave. Leah coughing softly into her scarf. Little Ben no longer crying, just watching with wide, hollow eyes. They had no destination, only an instinct. Forward. Somewhere beyond the woods, maybe, just maybe, there was a roof, a wall, a fire. Somewhere that wasn't the empty house they'd left behind, or the man who once promised forever but raised his hand when she asked why. Her breath came ragged, frost clinging to her lashes. Eliza didn't cry. Crying took energy. What she needed now was shelter, not answers, not justice. Just enough warmth to get her children through one more night. Then she saw it. A thin column of smoke, barely visible through the falling snow. Her heart kicked in her chest. Smoke meant fire. Fire meant life. And life meant maybe hope. The cabin stood alone at the edge of the clearing. A squat thing of old logs and a sagging roof, like it had braced against one too many winters. She hesitated, clutching Ben tighter. What if no one answered? What if someone did? Still her knuckles found the door, one knock, then two more. Not loud, not desperate, just enough to say, "We're here." The door creaked open. A tall man filled the frame, weathered face, silver-streaked beard. His eyes held the same gray as the sky, but there was no cruelty in them. No questions, no alarm, just stillness. He looked at her, then the children, then stepped back. "Come in," he said. "Not who are you, not what happened." Just two words. Enough. Eliza didn't speak. Her throat closed around relief too big to swallow. She stepped over the threshold into a space that smelled of wood smoke and silence. The door closed behind her with a soft finality. She didn't know his name, didn't know why he lived out here alone or what shadows followed him. But in that quiet gesture, a man opening his door without. The door clicked shut behind them, and for a moment all was still. Jonah stood by the entrance, his hand still resting on the latch like he wasn't quite sure if he'd made a mistake. The cabin, once a place of solitude and simple rituals, now felt smaller with 4 new bodies huddled in the corner near the hearth. He hadn't planned on this, hadn't asked for it, but he also didn't ask them to leave. Without a word, he moved toward the stove. The kettle, half filled from that morning, hissed as he set it back on the flame. He retrieved an old wool blanket from the chest near his bed, frayed edges, but clean, and handed it to the boy. The child looked up, surprised, then took it without speaking. He stoked the fire with practiced movements, stacking dry pine and feeding it slowly, carefully, like he was tending to more than just heat. His home had never felt crowded. Tonight it didn't feel crowded either. It felt occupied, like the quiet had finally found something softer to lean against. Eliza stayed close to the children, not quite sitting, not quite standing. Her eyes followed Jonas's every move, not with suspicion, but with the wariness of someone who had run out of reasons to trust. She didn't ask what he wanted. She didn't need to. His actions spoke louder than permission ever could. Jonas brought over a chipped cup of warm water, handed it to her without meeting her gaze. Then another for the oldest boy, then one for the girl. When he crouched down to offer the smallest child a chunk of bread, their eyes met, the child and the woodsman, and for the first time in a long while, Jonas saw something besides fear reflected back at him. The room settled. The fire cracked gently. Outside, the snow still fell, but the walls of the cabin held firm. Eliza finally lowered herself to the floor, her back against the wall, arms wrapped around her knees. She looked toward the man who had given them warmth without words, and in his silence, she recognized something achingly familiar. Not kindness exactly, but the loneliness that shapes it. The children curled beside her, lids heavy, breath slowing. And Jonas, from his chair near the window, watched them, not like a host guarding his space, but like a man remembering what it was like to have something worth keeping warm. He didn't know their names. They didn't know his. But for one night under one roof, in the middle of a snow-laced nowhere, 4 strangers and a woodsman shared something rare, a fire that didn't just heat the room. It thawed the spaces inside them that had long since gone cold. Morning crept in slow and silver. The light filtered through frost-laced windows like a soft breath held too long. The fire had burned low, but not out. Jonas was already moving when Eliza stirred, quiet in the half-light, stoking embers with the same care he'd given the night before. The cabin smelled of burnt bread and bitter coffee, not unpleasant, just real. Eliza sat up, blinking, unsure for a second where she was. Then she saw the chair where Jonas had sat most of the night, and the blanket now draped neatly over her children. It hadn't been there when she fell asleep. Jonas poured himself a mug, then, after a pause, filled a second and placed it near her without a word. His back was to her before she could speak, his movements steady, not cold, just practiced. A man used to mornings with no one else to consider. She took the cup, both hands wrapped around its warmth. Across the room, Leah coughed softly in her sleep. Nathan stirred and rubbed his eyes. Ben, the youngest, clung to the blanket like it was something sacred. Eliza glanced at the door. Her instinct said leave, that this was borrowed warmth, and borrowed places always come due. But when she looked through the frosted glass, all she saw was white. The world beyond the cabin had disappeared in snow. Jonas noticed her gaze. He didn't ask if she was going, didn't tell her she should stay. He just nodded toward the chair by the stove and said, "Best sit. Storm hasn't eased. Kids sound rough." It wasn't an invitation. It was an observation, the kind that only someone who knew solitude well could offer without pride or pity. She hesitated. Then she sat. He sliced a piece of bread from the crusted loaf on the table, handed it to Nathan with a nod. The boy hesitated, then accepted. Eliza watched them, unsure whether to step in or stay back. It was a strange dance, the rhythm of a man and a family not his, orbiting the same hearth. She took small sips of the bitter coffee. It wasn't good, but it was hot, and it was made by someone who didn't owe her a thing. Jonas worked on a piece of firewood in the corner, whittling off splinters where the grain had split. Not art, not decoration, just something to do with his hands. He didn't ask questions. But his eyes, when they occasionally met hers, had softened, not by much, but enough to notice. They didn't speak of why she came, of who she was, or what she had fled. But between the fire and the walls, between the steam from the mugs and the silence that no longer felt sharp, something shifted. He wasn't opening his heart. She wasn't offering hers. But for the first time in weeks, maybe months, Eliza didn't feel like she had to keep her boots on. No one said thank you. No one asked how long. But everyone, even Jonah's, breathed a little easier. By the third day, the cabin no longer echoed with caution. It breathed slowly, awkwardly, like a space relearning how to hold more than one life at a time. Jonas sat by the window with his carving knife, working on a piece of soft pine. The shavings curled onto the floor like fallen feathers. His hands moved with purpose, the kind that comes from habit rather than need. Across the room, Ben watched him not with fear but fascination. Without looking up, Jonas set down the knife and held out the half-finished shape. "It's a bird," he said gruffly. "Still needs wings." Ben took it with reverence, as if handed something sacred. He ran his fingers along the curved body, then looked up and whispered, "Thank you." It was the first time he'd spoken directly to Jonas. That afternoon, Nathan followed the older man outside, trailing him like a quiet shadow. Jonas was splitting logs rhythmically, precisely. Nathan picked up a smaller axe, not asking permission but waiting just long enough. Jonas watched him try. The boy's grip was wrong, his stance too stiff. But Jonas didn't correct him with words. He simply walked over, adjusted Nathan's fingers on the handle, gave a silent nod, then stepped back. Nathan swung. The log cracked, not clean, but enough. He grinned. Jonas nodded once, almost imperceptibly, and handed him another piece of wood. Inside, Leah was helping Eliza knead dough. Her fingers were clumsy, and flour dusted the table like snow. But she laughed when the dough stuck to her elbow, and Eliza, startled by the sound, laughed too. Jonas re-entered quietly, wiping his hands on a cloth, pausing at the door as if unsure he still belonged in a room with so much noise. Not loud, but not empty either. That evening after supper, Jonas returned to his carving. He added the wings to the bird, small notches shaped like they were mid-flight. When he gave it back to Ben, the boy held it to his chest and said, "It's flying now." Nathan started calling him Mr. Wood, and Ben, who couldn't pronounce that quite right, started calling him Woodman. The name stuck, but not in mockery. It was said with affection, the way children name things they want to keep. Eliza watched it all unfold, not quickly and not completely. Jonas still walked like a man unsure whether to stay or run, but he no longer flinched when someone touched his table, no longer stared at the door like it might vanish if he blinked. He didn't smile, not really. But when Leah handed him a lopsided biscuit and called it payment for firewood, he took it and ate it. Later that night, as the children curled under their blankets, the sound of laughter echoed against the old cabin walls. It wasn't loud, it wasn't constant, but it was real, and Jonas sat quietly in his chair, carving a second bird, listening like a man rediscovering music he used to know by heart. The snow had begun to melt. dripping from the cabin's roof in slow, steady rhythms, but spring didn't bring peace. It came with boot prints. Jonas saw them first, long before the knock on the door. Heavy, deliberate, cutting into the thawing ground like someone who didn't care to be quiet. He stood still by the window, hands clenched at his sides, eyes narrowing as the figure approached, clean boots, a stiff coat, a hat pulled low. Behind him, a second man held a folder under one arm. The knock wasn't like Eliza's, it wasn't gentle or hesitant. It was practiced, possessive. Eliza answered, her body tensing before she even saw the face. "Matthew," she breathed. He smirked. "You look well." Jonas didn't move at first. He let her decide whether to speak or close the door. But when Matthew pushed it open wider, stepping halfway inside without invitation, Jonas was suddenly there, a wall of quiet fury between him and the children huddled behind. The man with the folder cleared his throat. "We're here under the order of county jurisdiction. Mr. Matthew Crowley is petitioning to regain custody of his children, given the current irregular arrangement." Arrangement. Eliza's voice cracked, not from fear, but from disbelief. "You mean surviving in a stranger's cabin, because the man who left us thought a bottle was warmer than a bed?" Matthew raised a hand like he might wave away the past. "I've changed." Jonas didn't say a word. He didn't need to. His stance was answer enough, planted between the door and the man who once broke this woman's spirit. "You abandoned them," Jonas said finally. "Now you want them back because someone else proved they were worth keeping." Matthew bristled. "They're mine by blood, that's the law." Jonas didn't flinch. His voice was low, measured. "Then the law's wrong." The man with the folder shifted uncomfortably. "You're not married, not family. This could be a legal matter." Jonas stepped forward, one deliberate pace. "Anyone who wants to take these kids—" He looked past them, to where Nathan stood beside his mother, fists clenched. "Will have to take them from my hands." It wasn't a threat, it was a promise. Silence fell heavy. Then Eliza stepped forward. She stood beside Jonas, her chin raised not in defiance but in resolve. "You gave up your right the day you walked away," she told Matthew. "These kids aren't just yours because your name's on a piece of paper. They belong with the one who stayed." Matthew's eyes flickered to the children. Ben looked away. Leah clung to Eliza's skirt. But Nathan didn't look away. He looked straight at the man who fathered him and said with no tremble in his voice, "You're not my pa." Jonas didn't react, didn't blink. But Eliza saw it, the smallest tightening at the corner of his eyes. The man with the papers murmured something about reviewing options and returning another day. And Matthew, all sharp edges now dulled, turned on his heel and left. When the door closed again, Jonas didn't speak. He simply sat back down in his chair, picked up a new piece of wood and began carving, slower this time. And Eliza, standing in the middle of the room with her children pressed close, realized something clear and irreversible. Kindness wasn't passive. It wasn't soft. It stood up. It stayed. And sometimes it stepped between fear and the people who needed protecting, not because it had to, but because the news traveled fast, as it always did in small towns where fences were low and winters long. Within days of Matthew's visit, a hearing was arranged. not in some cold courthouse, but in the back room of the general store, beside shelves of flour and coffee tins. They called it a legal proceeding, but it felt more like a reckoning. Eliza sat beside Jonas, her hands folded tight in her lap, sleeves pulled low to hide the tremble. Jonas sat like carved oak, unmoving, unreadable. Nathan leaned forward, knees bouncing, while Leah and Ben stayed close, their small faces drawn but calm. Matthew arrived late, pressed shirt, slicked hair, a lawyer from the city trailing behind him, briefcase in hand, eyes scanning the townsfolk like he'd stumbled into a different century. The makeshift judge, Mr. Harland, a retired schoolteacher with bad knees and a sharper sense of justice than most paid men, cleared his throat and asked for statements. Matthew's lawyer spoke first, polished and distant. He laid out the facts. Matthew was the biological father, had secured employment again, had regretted the unfortunate lapse in judgment. He used phrases like best interests of the children and legal entitlement. Eliza didn't flinch. She had no rehearsed speech, no legal defense. But when they asked her to speak, she stood and for a moment just stood, letting silence say what no words could. Then she said, "I'm not here to fight him. I'm here because my children deserve to choose who makes them feel safe." An old man near the back, Mr. Finch, who'd once lost his son in a mining collapse, leaned forward on his cane and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear. "Man who opens his door in a storm, that's a father, not the one who waits for sunshine." There were murmurs, no objections. Jonas didn't speak. He hadn't planned to. But when they asked if he had anything to say, he stood and said simply, "I didn't invite them in to keep them. But once they were inside, I couldn't imagine sending them back into the cold." It was Nathan who turned everything. He stood, voice too loud at first, then steadier. "He's not my dad, but he's my pa." He looked at Matthew. "You left, he stayed. That's all I need to know." The room was quiet. Even the city lawyer looked down. No gavel was banged. No official decree was read. But the decision was clear. No one needed the law to tell them what was right, not when truth had already settled itself in the hearts of everyone present. Matthew didn't argue. He looked at his son, not with anger but with something that bordered on regret, or perhaps just the sting of being seen clearly for the first time. Then he turned and walked out, not in defeat exactly, but in acknowledgement. Outside, the wind had softened. The sun was melting the last crust of ice from the rooftops. Inside, Jonas remained seated, his hand resting on the table like he wasn't sure what had just changed, only that something had. Something big. Something real. Eliza reached for his hand. He didn't pull away. The children didn't cheer. They didn't jump. Spring arrived not with fanfare, but in quiet things, the sound of dripping from the eaves, the way light stretched just a little longer across the floorboards, and the soft green of shoots pushing through thawed soil. Jonas had planted potatoes that morning, rows of careful furrows in the softened earth behind the cabin. His hands, usually rough from axe handles and carving blades, moved with a strange gentleness through the soil, like he was tucking something in for safekeeping rather than burying it. Inside, Eliza rolled dough with steady hands. It wasn't perfect, too dry at the edges, cracked in the middle, but it smelled like home. Leah stirred something in a pot. Ben sat at the table with a scrap of paper and a stubby pencil, tongue peeking from the corner of his mouth as he concentrated. Nathan was outside with the hatchet, practicing under Jonas's watchful eye. Each swing of the blade was a little straighter now, the rhythm a little more confident. He wasn't just learning to split wood, he was learning how to stay. Later, when the sun dipped lower and dinner was warming, Ben held up his drawing. It was a picture, rough, uneven, of a tall man with a long beard, holding a bird in one hand and an axe in the other. Behind him, 3 small stick figures and a woman with a bun. The sun beamed overhead and the cabin was smiling. Ben had scrawled across the bottom in crooked letters, P.A. Wood. Jonas blinked, looked at the drawing, then at the boy. Ben grinned. "That's you." Jonas didn't speak, but he kept the drawing, folded it carefully, slipped it into the drawer where he kept matches and string and things he hadn't yet figured out how to throw away. That evening, Eliza stood in the doorway, watching the children chase each other beneath the trees. The snow was long gone, replaced by the golden hush of a day winding down. She leaned against the frame, arms folded loosely, and wondered, when did the quiet become something she trusted, not feared? When did her shoulders stop bracing for the next thing to go wrong? And when had Jonas stopped sitting alone at the edge of things? He passed behind her then, brushing her arm with his sleeve, carrying a plate to the table. No words, just presence. A man who had once lived like no one would stay, now moving like he was part of something worth feeding, worth tending. She turned back to the room. The fire cracked softly. The walls, once bare, now had drawings tacked unevenly with bent nails. A sweater hung from the back of a chair. Dishes waited to be cleaned. Life, messy, ordinary, beautiful, had crept in without asking. She didn't remember the moment it happened, but she knew this. For the first time in years, she wasn't guarding the door, and Jonas wasn't building fences. They were simply there, together, with names that meant something, and a season that, for once, promised. The evening had fallen soft and blue, the kind that makes even the shadows feel gentle. The cabin was quiet, not in that heavy way it once was, but in the restful hush of a home winding down. Jonas sat by the hearth, the fire casting flickers across his hands as he turned a small wooden bird in his fingers. It was Ben's, the same carving from weeks ago. The wings had chipped at the edges. He was smoothing them again, careful, like it mattered. Nathan stood nearby, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He wasn't fidgeting, just thinking, the way boys do when they know their next words will change something. "Jonas?" he asked. The older man looked up, eyebrows raised but not surprised. If I called you Pa, would that be okay?" Jonas didn't speak, didn't smile or brush it off like a joke. He simply looked at the boy, then at the bird in his hand. The room was still, fire cracking just enough to remind them time hadn't stopped. He ran a thumb along the tiny wing. Then, softly, he said, "A pa is the one who holds your wings until you're ready to use them." Nathan didn't answer. He just sat down beside Jonas, shoulder touching his, eyes on the bird. And Jonas, the man who once flinched at company, who once believed silence was safety, didn't pull away. Eliza had been watching from the kitchen, drying a cup with a towel she'd forgotten to set down. The moment stopped her mid-breath. She didn't cry because it hurt. She cried because it didn't. Because for the first time in longer than she could name, she felt wholly seen. Not as a burden or a widow or a woman trying to hold everything together, but as someone whose family, though patched and unexpected, was finally whole. The towel slipped from her hand. She didn't move to pick it up. In that small cabin, surrounded by chipped mugs, mismatched chairs, and a warmth that had nothing to do with fire, she realized something simple and seismic. Family isn't built by blood. It's built by the hands that... The knock came just after supper, light but steady, a rhythm too familiar to ignore. Jonas didn't rise. He knew before the door opened who it would be. Eliza stood up first. Not hurriedly, not braced for a fight, just steady, like someone who'd already walked through fire and no longer feared the smoke. She opened the door. Matthew stood there, coat dusty, face more sunken than before, like the weight of unfinished things had finally begun to settle on his shoulders. He didn't smile, didn't demand. His voice, when it came, was rough around the edges. "I just wanted to see them." Behind Eliza, the sound of laughter floated in from the back room. Leah arguing with Ben over who got the last biscuit. Nathan calling someone Pa without hesitation. Eliza didn't block the door, but she didn't move aside either. "They're fine," she said quietly. "Happy, whole, you don't get to break that again." Matthew looked past her, eyes catching on a shadow behind the window. Jonas, standing calm, watchful but not tense. He wasn't ready to fight, because he knew Eliza didn't need him to. She stepped forward, closing the space between them, not to threaten or scold, but to tell the truth. "You walked away once, and maybe that was the best thing you ever did for them." Matthew's mouth opened, but nothing came out. He glanced toward the sound of the children's voices, bright, unburdened, then looked down at his feet. "I don't have anywhere to go," he muttered. Eliza's voice didn't rise, it didn't soften either. "Then keep walking. You've always been good at that." There was no venom, just a release, the final click of a lock that had never needed a key. Matthew nodded once, not in understanding but in resignation. He turned, walked back into the dusk. No one watched him go. No one closed the door behind him, because some things, some ghosts, don't need banishing. They just need to leave. And when they finally do, what's left isn't silence or sorrow. Evening poured gold across the floorboards, warm and slow, settling into every corner of the cabin like it belonged there. The window was open just enough to let in the sound of children's laughter, real, unguarded, rising and falling like wind through tall grass. Eliza sat on the step, her hands resting on her knees, eyes watching the small figures racing around in the yard. Leah's braids bounced with every laugh. Ben chased after a wooden bird tied to a string, and Nathan, tall and sure, kept a watchful eye without hovering. Behind her, Jonah stepped outside, settling beside her without a word. The wood beneath them creaked, not from weight, from familiarity. She didn't look at him when she spoke. Her voice was quiet, not because the moment was fragile, but because it was full. "The day I knocked on your door," she said, "I wasn't looking for anything more than one warm night." Jonas didn't answer right away. He followed her gaze out to the yard, the corners of his eyes soft. Then he said, "And now?" She smiled. Not wide, not for show, just enough to crack something open. "Now I'm living." He nodded, like he'd been waiting to hear that. A gust of wind carried in the smell of soil and firewood. Someone inside dropped a pan. No one rushed to fix it. Nothing urgent. Nothing broken. Jonas leaned back on his palms, looking up at the sky turning the color of burnt sugar. "We're not surviving anymore," he murmured, mostly to himself. "We're living." Eliza didn't reply. She didn't need to. They didn't need to say love. Didn't need promises or titles or grand declarations. They had the door that stayed open, the hearth that never went cold, the children who called without hesitation, and each other not out of duty but choice. And in that quiet, golden moment, with no more storms on the horizon, they both knew. This wasn't a rescue, it was a beginning.